Mom, don't come today. Please stop bothering me. The words glowed on Helen Palmer's phone screen, sharp and cold, nothing like the daughter she had raised. The message pierced through her quiet living room like a blade, stopping her mid-step as she was arranging the last of the Christmas ornaments on a small pine table. Outside, winter sunlight slipped behind the rolling hills of her ranch, dimming the room until the message was the only thing that felt alive. Helen stood frozen, her fingers hovering above the screen. She reread the text again, slower this time, as if a careful second look would somehow change the meaning. Emily simply didn't speak this way, not to anyone, and especially not to her mother. For 70 years, Helen had trusted her instincts, first as a teacher guiding troubled teenagers, later as a widow learning to run her life alone. Her instincts had never spoken louder than they did now. This is not Emily. She picked up her glasses from the counter, slipped them on, and read it once more. The sentence was stiff, abrupt, mechanical. Emily's messages always carried warmth, even when she was tired or stressed from work at the clinic. She would send little hearts, quick jokes, or reminders to drive safe, Mom. Today, there was nothing but distance. It didn't feel like a boundary. It felt like a warning. Helen dialed her daughter's number. The call rang twice before jumping to voicemail. She tried again and again. Each attempt ended the same way. Silence, then the familiar recorded greeting. Helen set the phone down and pressed both hands against the counter, steadying her breath. Her kitchen smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. It should have been comforting, yet it only reminded her how far from safe her daughter might be. She replayed the last week in her mind. Emily had been subdued, saying work was stressful. She brushed off questions, insisting things were fine. Helen accepted it then, but now the pieces shifted into place. The forced smiles, the hurried goodbyes, the way she seemed to disappear into her thoughts. Beneath it all, Helen sensed fear she couldn't name. Her phone buzzed again. For a heartbeat, hope flared, but it was only a promotional message, nothing more. She exhaled and tapped Derek's contact. Her thumb hesitated. She never liked calling him. Something about the man unsettled her. He was polite on the surface, but his eyes always darted, calculating, as if measuring what someone could offer him. Still, he lived with Emily. He should know what was going on. He answered on the fourth ring. Helen? His voice was thick, heavy with alcohol. Background noise rumbled faintly, like muted laughter or clinking bottles. Derek, I've been trying to reach Emily. She sent me a strange message. She kept her tone even, careful not to provoke him. She's resting, he muttered. Long week, just let her sleep. Don't come over. The phrasing snapped Helen's attention. Not, don't worry, not, she's okay. It was an order, and the slurred rhythm beneath it carried something sour. I'd like to hear her voice, Helen said. No, she doesn't want to talk, he replied too quickly. Just give her space. Helen's grip tightened around the phone. Derek never cared about Emily's need for space before. Why now? She could almost picture him waving her off, beer in hand, irritation sharpening his mood. Did she tell you to say that? She asked. A long pause hung between them, stretched thin with suspicion. Look, he said finally. Just stay home tonight. Then the line went dead. Helen stared at the silent phone in her hand. The sinking weight in her chest settled into certainty. Something was terribly wrong. Derek's tone wasn't annoyed. It was evasive, protective, but not in a way that made sense. Protective of what? She walked to the window, pushed aside the curtain, and looked out across the ranch. The sky had darkened to deep blue, and her old pickup sat waiting near the barn. For a moment, she considered staying. Reason told her not to jump to conclusions, not to drive late at night, not to interfere. But reason had never raised a child. Instinct had. She turned away from the window and pulled on her coat. Her joints protested, but urgency carried her movements. She slipped on her boots, grabbed her truck keys, and checked the phone one last time. No new messages. Helen locked the front door behind her. The cold air hit her face, sharpening her senses. She stepped off the porch, rehearsing the possibilities in her mind. Maybe Emily really was tired. Maybe Derek was simply drunk. But with every step toward the truck, the doubts dissolved, replaced by something fierce and immovable. A mother goes when her child calls, and sometimes a mother goes even when the call is silent. Helen started the engine. The headlights burst through the darkness, illuminating the dirt road winding toward town. She tightened her hands around the wheel. Whatever waited at that house, she would face it, because Emily needed her. Helen could feel it in her bones. She pressed her foot to the gas and drove into the night. The road between Helen's ranch and town stretched like a thin ribbon under the winter sky. By the time she passed the last fence post, the sun was gone. Her truck's headlights cut through the dark, catching dry grass, old mailboxes, and the occasional reflective sign. Beyond that narrow beam, everything turned into black shapes and shadows. Helen sat stiffly behind the wheel. She had driven this road for years, for groceries, doctors, church. Tonight, every bend felt longer, every mile heavier. The familiar landmarks no longer comforted her. They only marked the distance between her and whatever waited at her daughter's house. The message replayed in her mind. "Mom, don't come today. Please stop bothering me." The words felt flat, stripped of the warmth Emily always carried. Emily teased. Emily soothed. Emily apologized too much. She did not shove people away with blunt phrases. She did not call her own mother a bother. Helen knew the rhythm of her daughter's speech as well as she knew the creaks in her old house. As a teacher, she had spent decades reading small shifts in tone and expression. She could hear shame in a student's forced joke. She could recognize fear in the way a locker slammed. Those quiet skills had never left her. Tonight, they told her one thing. Someone else had typed that message. She tried to remember the last visit. 2 weeks earlier, leftover turkey in plastic containers, Emily curled on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders. She had talked about her patients, about a boy who finally drew his first picture after weeks of silence. Her eyes had dimmed only when Derek spoke. He had complained about money, about long hours, about people who didn't understand what real work was. He hadn't said her name, but Helen knew. A cold draft slipped through a crack in the windowsill. Helen turned up the heat. Warm air hissed from the vents. She checked the clock. It was later than she liked to be on the road. A faint song drifted from the radio, a holiday tune. She turned the volume down until it was only a murmur. She tapped Emily's number again and put the phone on speaker. The ringing filled the cab. Then her daughter's recorded voice came on, bright and casual. "Hey, it's Emily. Leave a message and I'll call you back." Helen swallowed. "Emily, it's Mom. I'm driving over. I just want to make sure you're okay. If this is about something I did, we can talk. But that message didn't sound like you. Call me, please." She paused. "Just let me hear your voice." She ended the call and set the phone back down. The silence that followed felt thicker. The headlights swept over a dark form on the side of the road. For a second, it looked like a dog. Helen's chest tightened until the shape resolved into a torn trash bag and scattered cans. She exhaled slowly and forced her shoulders to relax. She thought of the first time she met Derek. Spring air, green fields, Emily's laughter as she led him up the porch steps. He had worn a pressed shirt and an eager grin. His handshake was firm, his words polite, but his eyes moved too fast, skipping from room to room as if taking inventory. Helen had decided he was restless and maybe insecure, not cruel, not dangerous. She wondered now if she had been wrong from the start. Little memories rose like small warning flags she had once pushed aside. The way he joked about breaking in the neighbor's dog. The way he dismissed Emily's work as playing with crayons. The way he spoke about strength as if gentleness were a flaw. On their own, None of those moments had felt like enough to confront. Together, they formed a line she could finally see. Town lights appeared ahead, a faint glow on the horizon. Helen passed the gas station and the small store without slowing. Her focus stayed fixed on the far side of town, where Emily and Derek lived in a subdivision that never quite matched the glossy brochure photos from years ago. The neighborhood was quiet when she turned in. Holiday decorations brightened the darkness. Strings of colored bulbs framed windows and roofs. Plastic reindeer stood in small yards. A few houses showed glowing trees in front rooms. In another season of life, Helen might have driven slower, admiring each display. Tonight, the bright colors felt strange, like painted smiles that did not reach anyone's eyes. She turned onto Emily's street. The tires crunched over gravel. Her headlights skimmed over a dented mailbox, a leaning fence post, a cracked patch of pavement near the curb. She eased off the gas when she saw the house. The Brannan home sat low and square in the middle of the block. Beige siding, small porch, fence around the yard. When Emily first moved in, she had hung baskets of flowers and arranged bright pots along the steps. Over time, the baskets disappeared. The pots broke. The color faded. Tonight, the house lay mostly in darkness. Helen pulled to the curb and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet rang in her ears. The only sounds were the ticking of cooling metal and a distant car on a different street. The neighboring houses glowed warm and yellow. Some had porch lights on. At Emily's house, only a faint blue-white flicker seeped from a thin gap at the edge of the living room curtain. A television, maybe, or a phone. She stayed in the truck for a moment, fingers still wrapped around the wheel. Fear rose like a slow tide inside her chest. Part of her wanted to back out and drive straight to the nearest station to ask an officer to come with her. But she pictured the conversation. An older woman, worried about a text that could be explained away. A son-in-law insisting his wife just needed rest. A busy night, a holiday. They might send someone eventually, or they might tell her to wait. She did not trust waiting. She opened the door and stepped out. The night air bit at her cheeks. Her breath puffed in small clouds. She shut the door carefully and stood still, listening. Wind brushed through bare branches. Far off, a dog barked once, then went quiet. Somewhere a television laugh track floated into the street, thin and distant. From Emily's house there was nothing. No music, no voices, no clatter of dishes. Helen walked around to the truck bed and pulled out a small flashlight. The metal casing was scratched, but the beam came on when she pressed the button. It cut a narrow path across the front yard as she approached the gate. The ground was uneven, with patches of dead grass and bare dirt. A faint scent lingered in the air, metallic and sour under the cold. At the gate, she paused. The latch was closed, but not locked. Her gloved fingers curled around the metal. One option was to turn back and hand this night to someone in uniform. Another was to walk forward and see the truth with her own eyes. She thought of the text. She thought of the silence. She thought of Emily's face when she was a child, reaching up from a nightmare, whispering, "Don't leave, Mom." Her choice formed itself long before she moved. She lifted the latch. The hinge gave a soft squeal as the gate opened. She winced and waited, every nerve straining for movement behind the curtains. Nothing. No shifting light, no shadow crossing the window. She stepped into the yard and let the gate click shut behind her. The sound seemed too loud in the stillness. She breathed slowly, counting her steps as she walked the short concrete path to the porch. 1, 2, 3, 4. The front door loomed ahead, a block of painted wood with a small glass pane at the top. Up close, she noticed faint scratches around the door handle and a chip in the paint near the bottom. She turned off the flashlight and slid it into her coat pocket. She didn't want to blind herself when the door opened. Helen raised her hand and knocked. 3 firm raps. The sound echoed in the cold air. She waited, feeling her own pulse in her throat. Inside, something moved. A floorboard creaked. The blue light shifted. Footsteps, heavy and slow, approached the door. She straightened her shoulders. "Derek!" she called, voice steady. "It's Helen!" The lock turned with a sharp, final click. Helen swallowed once and held her ground. Whatever stood on the other side of that door would decide whether this night ended with relief or with a nightmare she had never imagined. She was not going to run. She was a mother. She had come for her child. The porch light above Helen's head flickered once, then died, leaving her in the cold glow of her truck's distant headlights. She stood firmly in front of the Brannon house, her breath forming thin clouds in the winter air. The neighborhood around her shone with holiday lights and muffled cheer. But this house sat like a dead tooth in the row, dark, silent, and strangely still. Helen lifted her hand and knocked on the door. 3 firm strikes. The sound echoed through the wooden frame. For a moment, nothing happened. No footsteps, no shifting shadows, only the hum of a distant street lamp. Then, heavy, uneven steps approached from inside. A bolt slid back abruptly. The door cracked open. Derek filled the doorway, shoulders tense, jaw tight, eyes bloodshot as if he hadn't slept, or had been drinking far too long. A sour wave of alcohol drifted out with the stale indoor air. He stared at her, first with irritation, then something colder. "Helen," he muttered. "What the hell are you doing here?" Helen met his gaze without flinching. "I came to see my daughter." "She's sleeping," he snapped back. "I told you that already. You don't listen worth—" He cut himself off with a frustrated exhale and rubbed his face. "Look, she had a long day. Just go home." Helen shifted her stance, peering past him into the dim interior. Only the faint blue flicker of a TV illuminated the living room. Beer cans littered the coffee table. A jacket she didn't recognize lay crumpled across the arm of the couch. No sign of Emily. No sign of anything that resembled rest. "I want to talk to her," Helen said evenly. "Just for a moment." "No." The answer was immediate, sharp. His body leaned forward, blocking the doorway completely. "She doesn't want to see you." Helen watched his expression carefully. She saw no concern for Emily, no protective instinct, only agitation, as if he were guarding a secret. "Then let me hear her voice," Helen said. Derek scoffed. "She's out cold, and I'm not waking her up because you're having some whatever this is." He waved his hand dismissively. "You're overreacting." A tense silence stretched between them. Helen held his gaze, refusing to move. Then, behind the house, a sound pierced the quiet. A deep, guttural bark, followed by the metallic rattle of a heavy chain. Helen flinched before she could stop herself. Derek's expression shifted instantly. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes darted over his shoulder toward the backyard, just for a heartbeat, but long enough for Helen to catch it. "What was that?" she asked. "Nothing," he said too quickly. "Neighbor's dog." Helen knew every neighbor on this street. None owned a dog that size. Another bark erupted, louder this time, angrier, vibrating through the ground beneath them. Derek stepped outside, pulling the door closer to his body as if to block her view inside. "You need to leave, now. Emily doesn't want visitors." His voice rose with irritation, but underneath she heard something else. Not anger, fear. Helen's instincts sharpened like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Derek," she said quietly, "move aside." "No." His voice cracked. "I said go home." The chain rattled again. The dog's growl rolled through the night, deep and violent. It was the kind of sound no ordinary backyard housed. Helen straightened her spine. The cold seeped into her bones, but her resolve hardened. Something terrible was in that house, or behind it, and Derek was standing between her and the truth. "I'm not leaving without seeing my daughter," she said. Derek's eyes narrowed. His hand tightened on the doorframe. "You don't get to make demands here." For a moment, neither moved. Helen could feel her heartbeat thundering in her ears, but she kept her expression calm. The dog barked again, closer this time. Derek's mask cracked. His gaze flicked once more toward the backyard. "Damn it!" he muttered under his breath. Helen's breath hitched. That wasn't concern. That was panic. Before she could speak again, Derek stepped back and slammed the door. The deadbolt clicked sharply. Helen stood alone on the porch, staring at the closed door. The cold wind tugged at her coat. The house remained silent, except for the distant, low growl coming from somewhere behind it. Her instincts screamed the truth she didn't want to face. Emily wasn't asleep, and whatever was happening in that backyard, it wasn't meant to be heard. Helen descended the porch steps slowly, forcing her breath to steady. She walked toward the side of the house, keeping to the shadows, her pulse pounding in her ears. If Derek wouldn't let her in, she would find another way. A mother always does. The side of the house was darker than the front, swallowed by the shadow of the tall fence that ran along the property line. Helen moved carefully, placing each footstep with quiet precision. The cold night air stung her cheeks, but she barely felt it. Her senses sharpened, attuned to every sound. The crunch of grass under her boots, the distant hum of a passing car, the soft but persistent pulse of her own heartbeat. When she reached the corner where the side yard opened into the backyard, she stopped. The wind shifted, carrying with it a mixture of odors, damp straw, mud, and something metallic. Something unmistakably like blood. Her breath caught. She leaned closer, listening. A faint scrape, the soft thud of a chain against wood. Then a low, warning growl that vibrated through the ground. She edged forward and peered around the corner. The backyard spread out before her like a crude arena. Under the moonlight, the uneven dirt revealed scuff marks, disturbed patches of soil, and deep impressions where something heavy or someone had been dragged. A few rusted tools lay scattered near the fence. Old tires, stacked haphazardly, suggested makeshift barriers. Nothing about the yard resembled a family home. Helen's breath shook as she raised her flashlight. The beam trembled slightly in her grip. Then it landed on a massive chain anchored into the ground. The links were thick, too thick for a normal household pet. They stretched taut toward a large, reinforced kennel near the rear fence. The structure was crude yet sturdy, built from wire mesh and heavy wood. Too reinforced for any typical dog. Too deliberate. Helen swallowed, lifting the beam higher. Inside the kennel, the shadow of a large animal shifted, shoulders broad, head low, eyes reflecting the small amount of moonlight. The dog stared back, motionless at first. Then it took a slow step forward, and the chain rattled. Helen held her breath until her lungs burned. She forced herself to look away from the dog and instead began scanning the area around the kennel, the ground, the objects, the patterns left behind by hurried feet. Bootprints, several of them, laid a chaotic trail toward the back door of the house. Some prints overlapped, some dragged, and mixed among them were smaller indentations, the faint trace of someone being pulled. Emily, Helen thought, the name pulsing in her chest. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the yard. A whimper, soft, weak, but human. Helen froze. The hair on her arms rose. That sound wasn't imagined. It wasn't the dog. It came from somewhere near the kennel. She stepped closer, her flashlight beam skating across the straw-covered ground. Something glinted. Metal. A small camera mounted on a wooden post pointed directly toward the kennel area. Its lens was cracked, but the SD card slot remained intact. Helen's stomach twisted. Cameras, chains, reinforced structures. This wasn't a backyard. It was a ring, and Emily had somehow been brought here. Another whimper reached her, barely a breath, but enough to propel every nerve in Helen's body forward. She turned the flashlight toward the far side of the kennel. There, behind a stack of crates and straw bales, something shifted. Helen took one cautious step, then another. The moonlight caught on fabric, torn, dirt-covered. A sleeve. Her breath hitched and she took one more step. Then she saw it. A pale hand. Fingers curled weakly into the dirt. Her entire body trembled. "Emily?" she whispered, barely sound at all. The hand twitched, Helen's heart twisted painfully inside her chest. Relief and terror struck her in equal measure. Her daughter was here, alive, but hurt. Helen turned her body toward the crates, blocking the faint flashlight beam from the dog as she knelt. She reached out, gently brushing aside the straw. A face appeared, half covered in dirt, blood streaked across the cheek, hair tangled and matted. Emily. Her eyes fluttered weakly at the light, unfocused. Her lips parted, but no words came, only another faint, broken sound. Helen's breath shattered into 1,000 pieces. She reached forward, her voice trembling. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." The dog's chain rattled suddenly, jerking taut as it lunged. Helen whipped her head toward the sound, her pulse pounding against her throat. But the chain held. Still. She knew she couldn't stay exposed. She had to move, had to get Emily out. Helen wrapped her fingers around her daughter's wrist, cold and bruised. "Hold on," she whispered. "I'm getting you out of here." Emily's fingers weakly curled around her mother's hand. And for Helen, that single movement transformed fear into fire. She rose slowly, her body shielding Emily as best she could. Whatever Derek and his father had planned, whatever nightmare they had created here, she would not let it end tonight. Not while her daughter still breathed. The night air thickened around Helen as she crouched beside the crates, shielding her flashlight with one trembling hand. The dog's chain scraped across the ground again, a harsh, metallic sound that made every instinct in her body tense. But the chain didn't stretch far enough to reach her, or Emily. Not yet. And that small mercy was the only reason she could force herself to stay steady. Emily lay curled against the dirt, her body pressed awkwardly against the wooden slats of the kennel support beam. Her arms were bound in front of her with rough rope, the fibers digging into her skin, leaving deep, angry marks. One leg was twisted unnaturally, her jeans torn and soaked with dried blood. Her face, smeared with mud and crimson streaks, appeared almost unrecognizable, except for the faint, familiar quiver of her lower lip. Helen had seen countless injuries in her lifetime. Farm accidents, teenage fights at school, her late husband's long illness. But nothing prepared her for the sight of her only child, battered and left in the dirt like this. For a moment she felt her vision blur, not from the darkness, but from the crushing weight of helpless rage. Then Emily stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, thin and heavy. She blinked, unfocused at first, then slowly shifted her gaze toward her mother's silhouette. A soft sound escaped her throat, a mixture of surprise, pain, and the fragile hope of someone who has been alone too long. Helen leaned in quickly, pressing a finger gently to Emily's cheek. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Sweetheart, I'm here. I've got you." Emily's fingers spasmed, weakly trying to reach for her mother. The rope around her wrists pulled taut, stopping her movement with a cruel jerk. She winced and let out a muffled gasp. Helen's heart clenched. She shifted closer and began working at the knots binding Emily's wrists. They were tied with rough precision, the kind of knots she'd only ever seen on cargo or farm equipment, not something an amateur would think to use. Someone wanted to keep her restrained for a long time. As Helen tugged at the rope, Emily's gaze flicked toward the kennel. Fear flared in her eyes. Helen paused. "What is it?" she whispered. Emily shook her head weakly, as if trying to form words. Her lips parted, revealing a strip of fabric lodged deep in her mouth, tied behind her head. The gag was soaked through, stiffened by time, dirt, and blood. Helen's breath caught. She slid her fingers to the back of Emily's jawline, searching for the knot. "Hold still, sweetheart. I'll take it off." The fabric pulled free with a wet sound, and Emily coughed violently, her whole body shaking with the effort. Helen steadied her, bracing her shoulders. When the coughing subsided, Emily tried again to speak. Mom." The word cracked apart. She swallowed painfully, her throat raw. "Mom, they brought me here." Helen hushed her gently. "Don't talk yet. Just breathe." But Emily shook her head with weak urgency. She lifted her bound hands slightly, every movement strained. He said I talk too much. Her breath hitched. Said I was ruining everything. Helen didn't need more explanation. Derek and Martin. Her jaws tightened until she felt the pressure in her teeth. Behind them, the dog let out another sharp bark, lunging against its restraints. The chain groaned, stretched as far as it could. Helen instinctively shifted her body to block the dog's line of sight to Emily, though she knew it was an illusion of safety. If the chain snapped, or if someone released it, there would be nothing between them. Emily's breathing grew shallow. Mom, don't let them take me again. Helen cupped her daughter's face. No one is taking you anywhere. Do you understand? No one. For the first time, Emily's eyes focused, truly seeing her. That single spark of recognition cut through the fear like a blade. The rope binding her daughter's wrists loosened finally, giving way under Helen's persistence. She slipped the last loop free and felt Emily sag into her arms. But their moment of fragile relief shattered instantly. A door slammed open at the back of the house. Helen's head snapped up. She killed the flashlight in one swift motion, plunging them both into near total darkness. Footsteps pounded against the wooden steps, fast, unsteady, and angry. A man's silhouette appeared near the porch light, the faint glow behind him outlining his hunched shoulders. Derek. Emily? He called out, his voice tinged with irritation. Quit that noise! I told you to stay quiet. Helen felt Emily tense violently, burying her face into her mother's shoulder in silent terror. Derek stepped off the porch, scanning the yard with an annoyed grunt. Stupid dog, what's got you all riled up? The chain rattled again as the dog lunged, barking furiously at the darkness. Helen held her breath and pulled Emily closer, inching both of them deeper into the shadows behind the kennel. She could hear Derek muttering, the crunch of his boots against the dirt growing closer. Then, a second voice drifted out from the porch. Deep, older, hard. Martin Brannan. Hear something? He asked calmly. Dogs barking at nothing, Derek replied. Like always. Martin snorted. Should have put that thing down years ago if it can't tell the difference between a threat and wind. Helen's blood ran cold. They were too close, too aware, and too used to handling problems with violence. Emily trembled in her arms. Helen pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. Stay with me, she whispered. We're getting out of here. Above them, the men's footsteps shifted. Then, Derek's voice, annoyed. I'll check the chain. Make sure it's not loose again. Helen closed her eyes, gathering the last threads of strength she had. If Derek rounded the kennel, he'd see them. If the dog broke free, it would reach them first. If Martin joined in, there would be no escape. The backyard held its breath, and Helen prepared for whatever came next. The moment Derek's boots hit the dirt, Helen pulled Emily deeper into the shadows behind the kennel. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, but she forced herself to breathe quietly, move slowly, think clearly. The dog's chain rattled again as it lunged, its growls echoing through the yard. Derek muttered something under his breath and kicked at the stake securing the chain. The distraction bought her a few seconds. Seconds she used to ease Emily into a sitting position against the crates. Helen steadied her daughter's shoulders. Emily's breaths were weak, ragged, but her eyes were open now, wide with fear and something else. Urgency. Helen leaned closer. Sweetheart, don't speak. Save your strength. But Emily shook her head, her voice a broken whisper. Mom, they said they were going to make it look like the dog. Her throat tightened with pain, but desperation pushed the words out. They said I'd never talk again. If I talked now. Helen's chest constricted. The full meaning of Emily's broken sentences sank in with a sickening weight. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't punishment. This was a plan. A deliberate, calculated plan to silence her. Emily swallowed painfully. I found out what they're doing. In the shed. The dogs. Fights. Money. She barely got the words out. I told Derek I was leaving him. I told him I'd go to the police. Her voice trembled. He said I wasn't going anywhere. Helen felt the cold settle into her bones. A different kind of cold. One made from fury and terror combined. She turned her head slightly as Martin Brannan stepped off the porch, the wood creaking under his heavy boots. He carried himself with an unsettling calm, like a man walking into a chore he had done many times before. "Get on with it," Martin said to Derek, his voice low, gravelly. "Make sure she isn't screaming again. The neighbors heard something earlier." Derek grumbled. "Yeah, I'll handle it." Her daughter flinched at the sound of his voice. Helen tightened her grip on Emily's hand. Martin's silhouette moved closer to the yard's center, just far enough for moonlight to carve the outline of a shotgun resting casually over his shoulder. Helen's breath caught. Not just violent men, prepared men, men ready to finish what they started. A faint electronic beep sounded near the porch. Helen glanced toward it. Martin had opened a metal lockbox mounted on the wall and pulled out a small, handheld device. Something like a remote. She felt Emily tense again. "Mom?" Emily whispered, barely audible. "He used that to release the dog. When they brought me out here," her voice cracked, "they recorded it. For proof, for betting, for control." Helen's stomach twisted violently. Her gaze darted to the camera she saw earlier. The cracked lens. The SD card. Evidence. Evidence they were willing to kill for. Martin's voice carried across the yard. "When she wakes up again, she won't remember anything. She won't talk. She won't even leave the house unless we say so." Heat surged through Helen, rage so sharp it felt like fire under her skin. These men weren't planning to silence Emily just once. They were planning to control her forever. Derek moved toward the kennel, his flashlight beams sweeping the ground. Helen held her breath as the light passed dangerously close to her boot. A few inches more, and he would have seen them. He crouched at the dog's chain, checking the latch. "Stupid thing almost broke loose earlier." "Doesn't matter," Martin replied. "If she runs, the story stays the same. Dog panicked, dragged her, bit her. She fell on the fence. End of story." Derek let out a short laugh, humorless and cold. "Yeah, and the cops won't bother looking deeper. They never do." He paused, lowering his voice. "We just gotta keep the mother quiet. She keeps calling, showing up." Martin's tone sharpened. "I told you to handle that." Derek shrugged. "I tried." Helen's blood turned to ice. They were talking about her. Emily's grip tightened painfully around her mother's hand. Her voice trembled, pleading, "Mom, please, don't let them take me again." Helen cupped her daughter's face, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I won't. I promise you, I won't." She scanned the yard quickly, mind racing. There had to be a way out. A moment when both men's attention turned. A path she could drag Emily through without alerting the dog. Then she saw it. Near the fence. A break in the boards. A small gap where the wood had rotted away. Just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, especially someone as thin and weakened as Emily. But getting there would require timing, and luck, and silence. Martin stepped closer to Derek, lowering his voice. "We finish this tonight. No loose ends." He cocked the shotgun with a slow, chilling click. Whatever happened next, she knew she had only one choice. She would not lose her child tonight, even if it meant facing down monsters in the dark. For a moment, everything in the backyard went still. The dog's growls faded into low, anxious rumbles. The cold air hung heavy with tension, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Helen crouched over Emily, shielding her with her own body, her muscles locked in a mix of terror and resolve. Above them, Derek adjusted his flashlight again, sweeping the beam across the kennel area. He was close, far too close. If he took even a few more steps, he'd find them crouched behind the crates. And Helen knew what would come next. The shotgun Martin held was not for show. She forced her breath to slow. Her hands trembled, but her mind sharpened to a point. She had seconds, maybe less, to act. A scrap of metal glinted in the corner of her eye, the long, rusted handle of the kennel's reinforced cleaning tool, something like a metal rod with a curved end designed to hook and drag feeding pans toward the front. It leaned against the kennel wall, half buried in straw. Without taking her eyes off Derek, Helen slid her hand toward it. Her fingers brushed cold steel. She closed her grip around the handle, pulling it silently toward her. Emily, barely conscious, stirred. "Mom," she whispered weakly. Helen pressed her free hand gently against her daughter's arm. "Don't move, sweetheart. I've got you." The muffled reassurance steadied her own nerves more than Emily's. Derek muttered, shining his light toward the dog. "What are you going crazy about now, huh? There's nothing there." He knelt to check the chain latch. Martin, growing impatient, barked, "Hurry up! We don't have all night." Helen knew that tone, casual, confident cruelty, the kind that assumed victory before the fight even began. Not tonight. Helen rose just enough to plant her feet more firmly in the dirt. Her joints screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain. She angled the metal handle, tightening her grip. Derek jiggled the chain latch one more time. Damn things stuck. Helen struck. She lunged from behind the crates, swinging the metal rod with every ounce of strength she had. It cracked against Derek's wrist with a brutal snap. He yelped, dropping the flashlight as it clattered across the ground. The beam spun wildly, slicing erratic shapes through the darkness. "What the?" Derek stumbled backward. Before he could regain balance, Helen swung again, catching the barrel of the shotgun Martin had begun to raise. The metal rod slammed into the side of the weapon, knocking its aim skyward just as Martin pulled the trigger. The explosion shattered the night. A shower of wooden splinters rained down from the porch roof where the blast had hit. The recoil staggered Martin, buying Helen the opening she needed. "Mom!" Emily cried out, her voice cracking. Helen didn't look back. "Hold on!" she called, her voice steady, commanding. The dog lunged furiously at the noise, its chain yanking taut. Derek cursed and scrambled to grab the shotgun, but his injured wrist failed him. Helen pivoted toward Emily, yanking her daughter's arm around her shoulders. "Up," she whispered. "Come on, sweetheart. Stay with me." Emily's legs buckled, but Helen lifted, dragging her weight with raw determination. Martin recovered faster than she expected. "You stupid!" He reached for the shotgun again. Helen slammed the kennel's heavy door shut in a single motion, jamming the metal rod through the latch to wedge it closed. The sudden clang startled the dog, sending it into a frenzy. It rammed the inside of the kennel, barking so violently the structure rattled. The violent noise drowned everything else out. Martin's curses, Derek's groans, even Helen's own pounding heartbeat. "Move," Helen hissed. Supporting nearly all of Emily's weight, she staggered toward the back fence. The small gap she had noticed earlier, a rotted slat just wide enough, waited like a last lifeline. A gunshot cracked behind them. Helen threw herself to the ground, pulling Emily with her. Dirt sprayed over them as the bullet hit the soil inches away. Martin snarled, "Don't let them out!" Helen crawled, dragging Emily behind her until they reached the fence. Her hands fumbled for the loose slat, heart pounding so hard she thought it might tear through her chest. The board gave way with a brittle snap. "Through here," she whispered urgently. "Go, Emily, go!" Emily whimpered in pain, but obeyed, squeezing her battered body through the narrow opening. Helen followed, pushing herself through just as a heavy boot slammed against the opposite side of the fence. The wood shuddered. She landed on the other side, gasping, pulling Emily into her arms. Behind them, Martin shouted, "Find them! They can't get far!" Helen forced herself to stand, legs trembling, lungs burning. She tightened her grip around her daughter. "We're not dying here," she whispered. And together, stumbling, bleeding, terrified, but alive, they disappeared into the darkness beyond the fence. By the time Helen reached her truck, Her arms burned from holding Emily upright. Her daughter's weight sagged against her, each step a battle between gravity and desperation. The night felt darker than before, as if the sky itself had closed in around them. The cold air stung Helen's throat with every breath. She managed to open the passenger door and ease Emily inside. Emily winced, her body trembling, but she clutched Helen's sleeve with surprising strength. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere," Helen said, brushing tangled hair from her daughter's forehead. "You're safe now, I promise." She slammed the door and ran around to the driver's side. Her fingers shook as she inserted the key, but the engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed behind the tires as she sped down the old service road behind the Brannon property, keeping her headlights low. In the rearview mirror, the backyard fence shrank into the distance. For the first time that night, Helen allowed herself a thin breath of relief. But it was short-lived. Emily shifted, letting out a groan. "Mom, they're going to come after us." Helen tightened her hands on the wheel. "Let them try." She reached the highway, turned sharply, and pressed the accelerator. It wasn't until they were several miles away that she dared to slow down. Emily slumped against the seat, eyes fluttering. "Mom, the camera—" Helen glanced over. "What camera, sweetheart?" Emily's voice dropped to a rasp. "The one they filmed with the fights. What they did to me. It's in the yard." She coughed weakly. "If the cops don't see it, they'll say this was an accident." Helen's gut twisted. The SD card. She remembered the small camera she had seen mounted near the kennel earlier, had even brushed her hand against it while she searched for Emily. Her hand went to her coat pocket. The card was there. A small rectangle of plastic and metal, weightless, yet heavy enough to destroy the Brannon men. Helen swallowed hard and focused on the road ahead. "We have evidence," she said softly. "They won't be able to hide this anymore." The hospital lights were harsh and sterile, but Helen welcomed the brightness. Two nurses rushed Emily inside the moment Helen pulled to the emergency entrance. The warmth and safety of the clean hallways made her knees nearly buckle. "Please," Helen said, gripping a nurse's arm. "She was attacked. She needs help, now." The nurse nodded, seeing the severity immediately. "We're taking her straight to trauma. Stay here. We'll update you." Helen stood frozen in the hallway long after Emily disappeared through the double doors. For 70 years, she had been strong. Through losing her husband, through running a ranch alone, through building a life out of quiet resilience. But now her hands shook uncontrollably. She reached into her coat and pulled out the SD card, the only solid proof against men who had nearly killed her daughter. She closed her eyes and steadied herself. It was time to call Owen. Owen Rivers arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later, badge still pinned to his uniform, hair disheveled from being dragged out of bed. When he saw Helen, his expression shifted from concern to deep confusion. "Helen, what happened?" Her voice was steadier now. "My daughter was attacked. By her husband. By his father." Owen blinked, stunned. "That's a serious accusation." Helen pulled the SD card from her coat and pressed it into his hand. "Watch this, and then tell me if I'm wrong." Owen hesitated. "Helen, the Brannons have been in this county for a long time. They know people. They donate to half the town's events. If you're mistaken—" "I'm not," she cut in sharply. "Emily is in surgery because they chained her in a kennel and let a dog tear into her. They planned to make her disappear behind an accident report." She stepped closer. Her voice dropped, trembling with anger and exhaustion. "They told Derek to finish it tonight. They said no loose ends. My daughter was one of those ends." Owen stared at her, uncertainty flickering across his features. Then he looked down at the SD card. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Helen exhaled. "From their yard. They use cameras to film the dogfights. And whatever they did to her." Owen looked up sharply. Dog fights? Yes, she said. Illegal ones, with betting, with proof on that card. Owen turned the SD card over in his hand several times, as if weighing its consequences. Then, without another word, he pulled a small laptop from his patrol bag and slipped the card inside. Helen watched his face as the footage began to play. At first, confusion, then disbelief, then horror. He slammed the laptop shut. "My God," Owen whispered. "Helen, this is enough to bring half the county down on them." Helen's voice was cold. Good. Owen rubbed a hand over his face, pacing once in the hallway before finally composing himself. When he looked back at Helen, she saw that something had changed in his eyes. Determination, fury, purpose. "I'm filing for emergency warrants," he said. "Tonight, right now, the Brannons are not walking away from this." Helen let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. For the first time since she found Emily in that kennel, she felt a spark of hope. A small one, but real. Owen placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get them, Helen. All of them." Helen nodded, gripping the cool edge of the chair beside her. "Make sure," she said softly, "that they never get the chance to hurt anyone again." The hospital room lights dimmed as dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale streaks of blue along the linoleum floor. Helen sat vigil beside Emily's bed, her hands wrapped gently around her daughter's bandaged fingers. Machines beeped softly, their rhythmic tones the only proof that Emily was still fighting. Helen had not slept, could not sleep, not while the Brannons still breathed free air. At 5:12 a.m., the door opened. Owen Rivers stepped inside, uniform freshly pressed, expression sharp with purpose. He carried a tablet under his arm and a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there hours before. "Helen," he said, voice steady despite the storm beneath it. "We got the warrants." She exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging. "You're moving now." "In 10 minutes," he replied. "I came here first because I wanted you to know. We're not stopping until every corner of that property is uncovered." Helen rose and touched his arm. "Bring them in alive," she said calmly. "Let the world hear what they did." Owen nodded once. "They won't escape this." Then he left, closing the door gently behind him. Helen sank back into the chair, her gaze returning to Emily's sleeping form. For the first time, hope flickered. Not the weak spark of an overburdened heart, but a steady flame. Justice was on its way. The raid began at 5:23 a.m. Half a dozen patrol cars and an unmarked SUV rolled silently onto the Brennan property. Officers moved with disciplined precision, splitting into teams as Owen led the charge across the frost-coated yard. Inside the house, Derek jerked awake at the pounding on the front door. "Sheriff's Department, open up!" He stumbled out of bed, his injured wrist throbbing as he yanked on a shirt. "What the hell?" Another thunderous knock. "Search warrant! Step away from the door!" Derek cracked the door open just an inch too far. A boot slammed into it, knocking him backward. Officers surged in, shouting commands. "Hands where we can see them! Don't move!" Derek froze, his breath coming fast. "This is a mistake. Hey, I didn't do anything." But the protests died on his lips when he saw Owen. Owen's stare was cold, controlled, burning with betrayal, not of friendship, but of the trust that justice would always prevail. "Derek Brannon," he said, voice low, "you're under arrest." Meanwhile, a second team breached the backyard. A detective lifted the latch of the reinforced kennel door, only to recoil as the stench of blood and fear hit him. Good Lord! Lights illuminated the dirt floor, the chain, the hardened straw, the splintered wood from the shotgun blast, the camera mounted on a crooked beam, the signs of struggle marked clearly in the earth. Another officer pulled open the door of the small shed in the corner of the yard. Racks of chemical stimulants, containers of bloodied bandages, a metal cage too small for any living creature to stand comfortably, and crates labeled with coded symbols, records of the illegal betting ring. It was worse than Owen expected. He radioed the front team. "We've got full confirmation. Bring in the forensics unit and animal control. Now." Within minutes, a line of frightened, malnourished dogs was led out of a hidden enclosure behind the shed. Some trembled. Some barked through muzzles. All bore the scars of the Brannons' cruelty. One of the officers swallowed hard. "How long has this been going on?" Owen's jaw tightened. Too long. Martin Brannon attempted to escape through the back door when he heard the commotion, but officers were already waiting. "Martin Brannon, step outside slowly," an officer ordered. Martin sneered. "You people don't know what you're doing." Owen stepped forward. "We know exactly what we're doing." He produced the SD card from his vest pocket and held it up. "This was enough to open every door you tried to keep shut." Martin's expression faltered for the first time. "You're finished," Owen added. Martin lunged, but a stun gun dropped him to the ground before he took 3 steps. Hours later, Helen stood just outside Emily's hospital room as Owen returned. His uniform was dusty, his voice hoarse, but his eyes were steady. "It's done," he said. "We found everything. The kennel, the cages, the drugs, the ledgers, and the footage." He shook his head. "No jury will hesitate." Helen looked past him toward Emily, asleep but safe. "What happens next?" she asked. "Trial," Owen said, "and a very long sentence for both of them." Helen nodded slowly. Her spine straightened with quiet pride. "Thank you," she said softly. Owen shook his head. "You saved her, Helen. You went into that yard alone. You got the proof. You fought them with nothing but instinct and courage." He paused. "You didn't just bring us evidence. You brought the truth." Helen exhaled, a long, trembling breath that released the weight of the entire night. For the first time since she received that strange text message, she allowed herself to believe it. They were safe, and the Brannons were finally facing the justice they had tried so hard to escape. Winter sunlight filtered weakly through the hospital windows, warming the pale blue walls with a soft glow. Helen sat beside Emily's bed, watching her daughter breathe steadily for the first time since that horrific night. The worst of the surgeries were behind her. The bruises were fading, the bandages were fewer, and her color was returning. Slowly, but unmistakably. Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at her mother, and a faint smile touched her lips. "You're still here," she whispered. Helen squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't just reassurance. It was a vow. Emily's gaze softened. "Mom, thank you." Helen brushed a stray hair from Emily's forehead. "You did the hard part. You survived." Her voice trembled. "That's all I ever needed." 2 weeks passed before the trial began. The courtroom buzzed with tension as reporters crowded the hallway. Word of the illegal fighting ring spread quickly. Public outrage grew even faster. On the day of sentencing, Helen and Emily sat side by side, facing the men who had nearly destroyed their lives. Derek Brannon entered in shackles, his posture deflated. Gone was the swagger, the careless arrogance. In its place was a hollow shell of a man who finally understood the magnitude of his actions. Martin Brannon followed, chin raised defiantly as if he refused to acknowledge the unraveling of his empire. But Helen saw the fear hiding beneath his eyes, the fear of a man whose power had evaporated the moment truth was exposed. The prosecutor laid out the charges with precision: conspiracy to commit assault, aggravated battery, unlawful imprisonment, animal cruelty, racketeering, and attempted homicide. Each word struck like a hammer. When the final piece of footage played, the one showing Martin ordering Derek to make sure she won't talk anymore, the entire courtroom fell into horrified silence. Emily bowed her head, breathing shakily. Helen placed a comforting hand on her back. The judge's voice broke the stillness. "For the deliberate cruelty inflicted, for the intent to permanently silence a human being and for the operation of an underground criminal enterprise. This court finds both defendants guilty on all counts. Martin closed his eyes as the judge continued. Martin Brannon, you are sentenced to life in state prison. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Derek Brannon, you are sentenced to 40 years. Helen inhaled deeply. Not triumph, not vengeance, but profound relief. Justice had spoken, and it was loud. After the sentencing, Helen and Emily stepped outside the courthouse. Bright winter light washed over them, and for the first time in weeks, the world didn't feel dangerous. Reporters shouted questions, but Owen intervened swiftly, guiding them through the crowd. Give them space, he insisted. They've been through enough. When they reached a quiet stretch of sidewalk, Owen turned to them. It's finally over. Helen nodded. Thank you, Owen, for believing us. For fighting for her? Owen shook his head. You brought the truth. You went into that yard alone. You found your daughter when no one else knew she was even missing. He paused. You saved her. Helen's eyes grew damp. A mother goes, she said softly, no matter the cost. Emily leaned gently against her mother's shoulder. I'm here because of you, Mom. Helen wrapped an arm around her daughter, feeling the fragile warmth of life, of survival, of hope. Sweetheart, she whispered, you being alive, that's all that matters. Weeks later, Helen returned to the Brannon property, not out of morbid curiosity, but to reclaim the truth of what had happened. The backyard was empty now. The cages had been dismantled, the tools confiscated, the dogs rescued, the earth turned over and cleared. Where the kennel once stood, the sheriff's office had placed a small wooden sign. This place no longer belongs to cruelty. Justice stands here now. Helen stood quietly, hands folded in front of her. The wind rustled through the fence slats, carrying with it the faint scent of winter pine. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Emily was safe. The men who hurt her were gone. The truth had prevailed, not through violence, but through courage, persistence, and a mother's unyielding love. Helen turned away from the empty yard, walking back toward her truck with a steady, peaceful stride. As she opened the door, she whispered a final promise to the silent field behind her. They will never hurt anyone again. The engine rumbled to life. Helen drove forward into the pale morning light. With her daughter healing, justice served, and the weight of the nightmare finally lifted.